clearly 3 moments in which Hitler violated international law, and so we're going to go through each of these in greater detail. So starting off with the first one, which is the remilitarization of the Rhineland. First of all, why was it needed to be remilitarized? Well, it was demilitarized as part of the Versailles Treaty, which said that Germany was not able to have a union with Austria. They were not able to have an air force, submarines, tanks, and their army had to be limited to a token force of about 100,000, which would, barely be enough to defend itself against its neighbours. So to have 100,000 troops being able to defend all of those frontiers is, it wasn't serious, and the German people recognised it as such. Also, on top of that, they had to pay an exorbitant amount of war debts, and when the Germans couldn't pay those war debts in 1923, the French and the Belgians invaded the Ruhr Valley. The Ruhr Valley being the industrial heartland of Germany on the Rhineland. This was invaded, it was occupied, and it led to a great deal of bitterness. It explains the beer hall putsch, it explains many different things, the hyperinflation, everything, right? And this left a very nasty taste in the mouth of many Germans. If you had just gone in and invaded just at the wrong time, then this is something that very likely would have ended up happening. You would have had a repeat of the occupation of the Ruhr, because Germany would have felt like it had been done wrong by France once again. Now, the Versailles Treaty was pushed forward predominantly by France. Britain and America wanted to be a bit more lenient towards Germany. They wanted to punish them a little bit, but they didn't want to be too harsh on them, because they wanted to maintain this balance of power within Europe. Particularly for Britain, our policy goal with regards to the continent has always been, for the past 500 years at least, to ensure that no one single country ends up dominating on the continent. By completely destroying Germany, as the Versailles Treaty did, the problem with that is that it left France completely without any competition on the continent. Add to this the fact that France also started to implement what was known as the Cordon sanitaire. See, my French is getting a little bit better now, a little bit better than the earlier videos. So the Cordon sanitaire. This was basically the nations of Central and Eastern Europe, and the idea of this was that in the event of a war between France and Germany, France would employ its allies to the east of Germany, such as Poland, Czechoslovakia, Romania, etc. All of these countries would gang up on Germany, and so Germany would be encircled by its enemies. Now, what's often not said with regard to the remilitarization of the Rhineland is this. Hitler's pretext for the remilitarization was this. France made a mutual agreement with the Soviet Union. So this meant that they made basically a military alliance with the Soviet Union. If Germany invaded the Soviet Union, as Hitler had clearly said in Mein Kampf was his intention, then France would go to war with them, and vice versa. However, France was making many of these kind of agreements, but it had no real will to actually stick to them. Within that agreement, it said that France would go to war with Germany if Germany invaded the USSR. However, there were so many caveats in it, and the main caveat was that they would only go to war with Germany if Britain and Italy also went to war with Germany. And as we know from our own timeline, Italy did not go to war with Germany. Italy joined Germany and fought the Allies. So we can see within this the inherent flaw of this. You're making military alliances with countries which you have no real will to actually back up. Now, we have to understand within this why France wanted to be so punitive against the Germans. Within World War I, they lost 1.4 million people, and a great deal of the French countryside was destroyed. Even today, they still are digging up shells and unexploded mines in the land which was once the Western Front. You can understand from a French perspective why they wouldn't want German troops west of the Rhine. However, it's quite unreasonable to demand a country to not put any of its troops into another region within itself. George Bernard Shaw made the very apt point that it would be the equivalent of saying to the British, hey, you know what, you can have an army, but you're not going to be able to march them to Portsmouth, okay? Or it would be maybe the equivalent of saying no British troops in Kent. It'd be like, what? That's insane. Like, you don't have any right to say where our troops can go within our own borders. So remilitarization of the Rhineland was something which was very, very popular within Germany, because they felt that they obviously had a clear right to be able to have troops within their own territory. And it was obviously one of the main things that Hitler wanted to get rid of within the Versailles Treaty, because that was just the most obvious kind of like humiliation. And Germany had already been rebuilding itself. There'd been rearmament from March of 1935, in which their military spending went up, the level of troops went up. Now, to remilitarize the Rhineland, Germany only sent 3,000 troops. Now, this was in two parts. One, because if they sent a large army, it might be seen as an aggressive act, and it would provoke the French and British to actually go to war with them. Second of all, if they only sent a small amount and they were inevitably going to be kicked back, then he could say to the German people, look at this, even with this tiny force of 3,000 troops, the Allies have still been completely unreasonable when they kicked us out. So it was a win-win for Hitler, and that's why he kind of took the gamble. But even still, with these 3,000 troops, at any point within this campaign, if the French or the British had sent troops across the River Rhine and attacked Germany for remilitarizing the Rhineland, Hitler would have ordered those 3,000 troops to retreat. Now, historians have looked back at this and debated why the French didn't attack. Now, there is this kind of myth of the French being cheese-eating surrender monkeys, and they might have a point, but what you have to understand is that France in 1936 was not in the best shape to start a world war. So first of all, France didn't have a government. It had a caretaker government. Second of all, obviously, the rest of the world, France was experiencing the fallout from the Great Depression. On top of that, many different countries around the world, like in particular Britain and America, had come off the gold standard. So this meant that the rest of the currencies around the world, which had been pegged to this gold standard, all of a sudden had to devalue themselves. The French franc had to be devalued during this time, and there was a lot of disruption, a lot of unemployment being caused by all of this. And with an election coming up soon, the French people were like, well, actually, this talk of a war is actually going to push our economy over the place. So as much as possible, we don't want to really go to war with Germany. It's only been 18 years since the last one. Let's just see how this thing goes. And on top of that, the British were not in favour of any kind of attack. Even Foreign Minister Anthony Eden, who would later become, at a later point he'd become Prime Minister, but he had been seen as a very kind of person who was in the staunch kind of anti-Hitler camp. But even still, he was even sceptical of sending troops in, because it would have been seen as basically a repeat of the Ruhr. It would have been seen as very, very unreasonable. British public opinion at the time did not want a war. People were very, very sceptical of it, and they saw no problem whatsoever with Germany sending its troops to another part of its own territory. And so if France had attacked, it probably would have been alone. It's very unlikely that the French would have had the stomach to have fought a full-scale war with Germany so soon after the last one, without the backing of Britain. However, obviously, we can look back with hindsight and say, damn, I wish you'd done that. I wish you'd gone, and I wish the French had gone to war. But even the Pope joined in on this. It's really bad when even the Pope, he's supposed to be the man of peace and love, and said that if 200,000 French troops had been sent in there, then they would have saved everyone else the trouble that came later. However, like I said, this probably was not the right time to have gone to war with Hitler. The German people were still very much in favour of Hitler, and it would have been seen as a very punitive, a very brutal kind of a put down. I think a lot of people in Germany still would have supported Hitler and thought that what he had done was completely reasonable, and that any country, any self-respecting country, would have done the same. The next scenario is going to be March 1939. Now, people watching this who know the history may question why I haven't included Munich in this, and there's probably a strong argument that you could make for doing that. However, Britain and France were not in favour of going to war over Sudetenland. As Neville Chamberlain said, like, kind of, why would people in Britain want to go to war with Germany over far distant land that, like, most people, like, didn't even know existed? So Munich was very much an agreement between Britain, France, and Germany that they wouldn't go to war over the Sudetenland. The Sudetenland was predominantly German, and actually it was very, very, not just pro-German, but very, very pro-Nazi. Just to give a statistic on this, 17% of the Sudeten Germans were members of the Nazi Party. In Germany itself, that number was just 8%. So more than twice as many people in the Sudetenland identified with the Nazi Party than with Germany itself. This means that the 3 million Sudeten Germans who lived within the borders of Czechoslovakia, they were very, very much in favour of rejoining Germany, and the amount of fuss that they would have kicked up, eventually they would have risen up, they would have done something, yeah, like, so at some point Sudetenland was going to be absorbed by the Reich, whether by peaceful means or by violent means. Now, what was inexcusable and what really, really turned people around the world against Hitler was in March of 1939, so just a few months after Munich, where Hitler had said, "I have no more territorial demands, I have no more ambitions, that's it." He did something which he hadn't even said that he'd do in Mein Kampf, and that was to invade the rest of Czechoslovakia. The argument for taking the Sudetenland was that, okay, right, it's self-determination. After World War One, every other country gets to self-determine. Poland goes to the Poles, like Czechoslovakia goes to the Czechs and the Slovaks. Why is Germany the only country that's not allowed to self-determine itself? Why are Germans not able to unite with the Austrians? Why are Germans not able to unite with the Sudeten Germans? That was the kind of argument for it, along ethnic lines, along linguistic lines. It made some level of sense to say that actually every other country in Europe is able to self-determine. Why can't Germany? However, the invasion of the rest of Czechoslovakia completely flew in the face of this, right? And actually, I would say, of these three scenarios, this is the one where, like, they should have invaded. It was a clear violation of Versailles. It was a clear violation of international law. There was no legitimacy for this. Taking a country of about 7 million Slavic people, when you're talking about we want to just reunite with, like, other German-speaking places, that completely flies in the face of it. This was just naked aggression. This was naked occupation. And actually, the president of Czechoslovakia almost had a heart attack when Hermann Goering, the head of the Luftwaffe, threatened to bomb Prague. You know, Hitler and his cronies brought Hatcher, President Hatcher. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. My Czech's not great. Brought President Hatcher to Germany and made him sign in the dead of night basically a surrender terms, yeah, which basically said, yeah, Czechoslovakia will be given up to Germany without a fight. It turned British public opinion against Hitler because he clearly couldn't be trusted. He clearly had broken his own promises. And also, it's March 1939. You have the whole of spring, you have the whole of summer. You would have had plenty of time to have actually planned things, to have put troops in order, and to actually start, like, launching campaigns against Germany, which, don't forget, they were remilitarizing. Their army was huge by 1939. It had grown to 3 million men from the 100,000 it had been before. And also in terms of spending, Germany between 1935 and 1937 ballooned its military budget, yeah, by almost tenfold, okay? So yeah, so I'll have the stats on screen now of, like, all the different years for Germany, and also all the different years for Britain, and just comparing those two in terms of military spending. I wasn't able to find figures for France, so those will have to do for now. But that gives you some kind of idea of just how huge the German rearmament program really was. But even still, Germany was not prepared to fight a war of that scale in the spring of 1939. And actually, if the British and French had been serious enough about it, they could have attacked. And actually, if there had been an attack, there was a plot within the German high ranks known as the Oster Conspiracy, in which the German military would have launched a coup against Hitler, overthrown him, and then restored peace and like law and order to the Reich. This almost happened in our timeline, and the only reason it didn't happen is because Britain and France didn't act, and therefore Germany paid no price for this naked act of aggression. They'd already left the League of Nations, And actually, even in the remilitarization of the Rhineland, the only country within the League of Nations that voted against them was the Soviet Union. And the same thing again happened with this. Like no countries really did anything about it. Much as had happened in Manchuria with the Japanese in 1931, much as happened in Abyssinia when Italy invaded in 1935, the League of Nations did nothing, the Western Allies did nothing. They sat there and allowed a naked act of aggression by dictatorial powers. So I think that this would have been the perfect opportunity to have attacked Hitler, to have invaded Germany. This was the last time at which you could have attacked Germany, taken Hitler out, and taught the Germans enough of a lesson, like without A, them being embittered, and B, without it just being a very drawn out and long war. Anything that was done after this time just meant that it was going to be a long war. And as we know from our own timeline, this war lasted for 6 years. If it had been done properly in the early months of 1939, then we might have had a very different history.